Hello, my name is Amy Jacobs, and I'm here to present to you the beginnings of the horror-centric controlled vocabulary thesaurus that I have created and begun to work on as the final project for our description and access of archives class. This project began on a dark and stormy night in 2012 when I walked into my graphic novel class sopping wet from the rain and discussed with my soon-to-be thesis advisor the idea that I wanted to research The Walking Dead and the zombie metaphor as allegory for my thesis defense to earn my master's in English literature. As I began to research, I quickly learned that there was very little information on horror studies to begin with because it was still a burgeoning field, but also that I had no reference for the type of terminology I should be using. I also learned very quickly that no such reference document existed. And so, for the last 12 years, I've built my own personal horror archive in my home library that has horror studies texts, horror films, all sorts of horror goodies for my own use. And in that time, I have also come to find the Horror Studies Center, the George A. Romero Foundation, and other horror studies interest groups that have allowed me to build the vocabulary I so desperately needed. So when we started this course, I immediately knew that I wanted to create a horror-focused, controlled vocabulary thesaurus for a reference guide for librarians and archivists. And I am self-aware enough to know that most people, if not all people within our field, are very unlikely to have the broad range, special interest, niche thing that I have with horror. So, in that regard, I would argue that this kind of text needs to be first and foremost user based, that it needs to take into account that most people working with these types of materials are not going to have the necessary foundational knowledge to properly catalog them for researchers who would be looking for these materials. Further to that length, it needs to be terminology rich. There needs to be a cross referencing system within this document that allows for the areas or of terminology that a scholar would likely look for to be available to them and connected to the works. It needs to be interdisciplinary in that the horror studies field itself is interdisciplinary, it brings in areas of film, fiction, philosophy, psychology, sociology, anthropology. And so considering those areas is important in creating any kind of subject thesaurus. And finally, as an archivist, to me, two of our most important values are interoperability and access. And by ensuring that we consider those at all areas, at all levels of our creation process, I hope to make this document something that allows for enhanced and exponential access to these types of archival materials. So, in this vein, as I began to construct my controlled vocabulary thesaurus for horror objects, I thought about the various elements that we consider whenever we archive any object. Things like MARC records, EAD requirements, DAX considerations, but also just standard controlled vocabulary as it exists already. So things like the Library of Congress subject headings and authorities, as well as the Library of Congress genre and form thesaurus. So I took all of those elements and used them to think about how I would construct such a document that I want to construct. And to this end, I turned to a book that I had started working on almost 5 years ago um, because of the problems I was having finding comprehensive horror sources. And so I started a logbook where I basically logged every horror film title I could find from 1920 to 2020. I did 100 years of horror history, and I tagged various subgenres as well as actors and actresses and the like, because I wanted to create something comprehensive. So as I began the project, I started to type out my film list and see what kind of information I had available and how I would want it to look in the hands of an archivist if they were looking to catalog or describe a specific item in their hands. So to that end, I took one specific film, which was The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, released in 1920, and I applied the types of terminology that I would want to see included in a reference guide for a horror centric controlled vocabulary thesaurus. And this meant that I wanted to focus on cross referencing. To me, cross referencing within the horror genre is incredibly important because there are so many interrelated topics of conversation within the genre that horror studies scholars want to look at and often search for. So on the screen in front of you, you'll see the various elements that I feel would be important to include in such a thesaurus, and the types of coding and terminology that one would see once this book is completed. So once we add that cross-referencing and include the Library of Congress headings as well as the additional materials that I'll be including as the process goes along, one can see what this type of document would look like as it evolves from just a basic film list to a proper controlled vocabulary thesaurus for use in cataloging and archiving these particular horror objects. In conclusion, as I step forward on this project, I would just like to ask my fellow archivists and librarians to always remember that horror does matter.